We continue on in our series in Esther. So if you don't know, you maybe do or don't know, on Monday and Tuesday of just last week, the 5th and 6th of March, it was the Jewish festival of Purim. And the Jewish festival of Purim finds its origins actually here in this book of Esther that we've been going through for the last couple of months. We're coming to the end of it, which is both sad and good, great, and fine, whatever, all good things must come to an end. Here's another little side note. It's funny. We as Christians, we have a firm sort of theology of death and resurrection. Things come to an end and new things sprout up in its place. The seed has to die for the plant to grow, kind of a thing. But whenever we have a good thing, we're like, no, don't let it stop. Yeah, it's cool. It's cool for good things that we've enjoyed to stop. We don't have to always do things in perpetuity and get worn out, keeping the same things going. We can hold things loosely and be chill. Esther's going to end. That's all right. It's been a good study so far, I think. Well, bold of me to say. I've thoroughly enjoyed it because there's some things in Esther that we maybe haven't always clocked or taken notice of. For instance, that Esther is it's presented in a bit of a pantomime sort of a way. It's kind of a comedy. That doesn't mean that it's not historically reliable. It just means that the presentation of the history is rather exaggerated in certain ways in order to make us laugh. And that making us laugh is in order to make a point. And to make a point that actually nations rise and nations fall, and all of these great global leaders that we think are really important and unstoppable and impenetrable and omnipotent actually aren't. They're really quite silly, Nevertheless, within those silly and mockable structures of power within the world, God has placed his people. We find Esther and Mordecai placed very specifically and very intentionally by God within this world system to accomplish his purposes. And very serious stuff does happen even within these absurd and mockable world structures. And so we see Esther and Mordecai representative of sort of all of God's people in a certain sense, at a time and in a place where there was question about who actually belongs to God's people or not. This is a time of the Persian Empire. It is a real historical empire just before Alexander the Great conquers it. All right, so Xerxes is a real king. And the Jewish people have really been in exile in this empire and have been allowed by a previous king of Persia, Cyrus, to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple and rebuild the city. And so there's a question about who are the real Jews. Are the real Jews the ones who have gone back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple and all of the worship? Or are the real Jews the ones who are still out in exile experiencing God's discipline? And so there's a little bit of a contest. And what we find with Esther and Mordecai is, first of all, their names are reflective of Babylonian gods. Babylon was the empire previous to Persia, who had conquered the southern kingdom of Judah and conquered Jerusalem. So they don't have, we don't frequently reference them by their Hebrew names. We don't even know Mordecai's Hebrew name. We know Esther's was Hadassah. That was her Hebrew name. But we know them by their Babylonian names, named after Babylonian gods. There's no prayer mentioned. It's inferred by fasting, but it's not specifically mentioned. God isn't mentioned in the whole book of Esther. Jerusalem, the temple, the covenant, none of this stuff is mentioned. All we find out is that Esther and Mordecai are in fact Jews, and fasting is something that they do. And so we find out that actually sometimes God's people go sort of unrecognizable on the surface. And sometimes it's easy to judge that. Can I just be bluntly honest? I tend to be I have a proclivity for to be a bit more hardcore, right? That's in my sort of makeup. I'm sort of purist is a little bit too strong, but hey, listen, if you're gonna be a Christian, be a Christian. No shame. Stand up, be recognized, and stand for that which is which is well and truly, thoroughly Christian. Thank you. I appreciate that. Sometimes, though, it's easy for me, if I'm being really vulnerably honest, it can be easy for me to be dismissive of that which is sort of superficially Christian. and be like, come on, guys, get your thumb out and let's get going. You know? And so there's something about Esther that sort of challenges me. You know, Esther and Mordecai, everyone in Jerusalem would be like, might as well just be Persians, really. But nevertheless, God has them. They're a part of his people, and he has a purpose with them. You know, and Esther maybe is engaging in things like, she's the queen. Did she marry Xerxes? Did she not marry Xerxes and just become the queen? I mean, it's a bit ambiguous. But at any rate, it's a little bit like not what a good Jewish woman does, marrying a Gentile man. You know, there's all these kinds of things. And so that kind of gets in my space a little bit. Esther does, if I'm being honest. And I need to consider that. Nevertheless, Esther and Mordecai, there's sort of this, are you really Jew? Well, no, you really are. Even though it looks pretty superficial at a certain level. Yeah, you fast, but you just fast. Prayer is just inferred. But also Esther and Mordecai have this way in which they represent, Mordecai represents sort of God, and Esther sort of God's people and the nature of their relationship. There's another sort of fractal, there's another sort of metaphor at play here. And that's not to say that Esther and Mordecai aren't real people. I'm just saying that in God's sovereignty, and in this story, they're representing more than just themselves. And indeed, sometimes God goes under the radar. And he goes under the radar. Well, Mordecai's both above and below the radar in certain respects, because he keeps on being called Mordecai, the Jew. All right. But God has a way of insinuating himself and his people in the world for his purpose. And that's a good thing. A challenge to me is not to not be dismissive of that when I'm busy in Jerusalem, like, let's build the temple, come on. All right, so that's a word from me. We're going to pick it up with that understanding. Oh, yeah, and so we got Mordecai and Esther, and there's this guy, Haman. Haman hated Mordecai, and so he had this plot for genocide of the Jewish people throughout the whole Persian Empire. It gets foiled, right? Haman ends up getting impaled, and this whole, what do you say, kill, death, murder. This whole kill, death, murder sort of sequence of events unfolds, which is both kind of hyperbolic and a bit sort of dark humor, and also very, very serious indeed. And there was this edict that went through all of the Persian Empire that on a certain day that was arrived at by Haman casting lots. On that same day now, the Jewish people get to defend themselves. If people come to attack them and to plunder their goods, as per this genocidal edict that Haman had spread throughout the whole empire, now the Jewish people have the opportunity to defend themselves, all right, if anyone attacks them. And so that's where we pick it up in chapter 8, verse 15. This edict that the Jewish people can defend themselves has gone throughout the whole empire. Verse 15 of chapter 8, when Mordecai left the king's presence, he was wearing royal garments of blue and white, a large crown of gold, and a purple robe of fine linen. And the city of Susa held a joyous celebration. For the Jews, it was a time of happiness and joy, gladness and honor. In every province and in every city to which the edict of the king came, there was joy and gladness among the Jews, with feasting and celebrating. And many people of other nationalities became Jews, because fear of the Jews had seized them. Let's pause right there for just a moment. One of the things we see is now Mordecai is decked out in all of this royal attire. Blue and purple and white and a crown. And one of the things that we see throughout the book of Esther, if you've been kind of tracking with us, is that Mordecai is constantly being exalted. No matter how much he is or is not pursuing that, and he's not really pursuing that, no matter how much those who are against him are trying to not only keep that from happening, but actually physically kill him, there is this inevitability of his honor and glory that gets realized. And so there's two things I just want to clock from this. One is the inevitability of God's people's elevation. I think there's certain ways in which, in the current climate of things, it does feel like it's somewhat tenuous or stressful to clearly be identified as a part of God's people in the world. And if one is open about that, there are certain assumptions that might be made, particularly if you identify as a Christian and you take that seriously. There are certain tropes and narratives around misogyny and homophobia and bigotry and all kinds of other stuff that kind of can get lobbed into that. And we kind of go, I don't want anything to do with that, so I'm spiritual, right? And people are like, oh, cool, I'm spiritual too. And there's a sense where some of us might feel that like, ooh, to be a Christian and to be clearly identified as a member of God's people might have a consequence of social detriment and despisal. And certainly there have been, like, time after time after time, seasons in the life of God's people where that is the case. Again, we keep on talking about this fractal, this pattern of descent and ascent. With God himself descending and becoming Jesus and descending to death, into the grave, into Hades, and then ascending in resurrection and back to the Father. And we see this pattern work itself out time and time again. And we're seeing that pattern yet again here with Mordecai in his ascent. Involuntarily, even when Haman, his enemy, wanted to see him killed individually, Haman ends up being the one who has to parade him around the streets of Susa, saying, this is the one the king wants to honor, on the king's horse, with the king's clothes. Haman's spending so much time trying to make himself king. He wants to be one wearing the king's clothes. When Esther identifies him as the genocidal lunatic, and Xerxes leaves the room and then comes back, and Haman is groveling at Esther's feet on the couch, and there's almost this insinuation that Haman is trying to take the kingship by actual force. For those watching online, in case there's kids around. He's just desperate to make himself the number one. Mordecai is not even trying, and it just keeps happening. God and his people will always bubble to the top. But here's the thing. It's not about bubbling up to the top. That's the wrong hook. Ooh, I want to bubble to the top. No. But for Mordecai, it keeps happening. God will be honored. God will be honored in the nations. The prophet Isaiah, the knowledge of the glory of God will cover the earth as the waters cover the seas. Even when, perhaps, he's not even necessarily being identified properly. Still, his honor and his glory will be elevated, as with that of God's people. God's people are united to him through covenant. And a covenant is like a marriage, right? Where two become one. And this is this fractal, again, this pattern that repeats. The Trinity, the first and second person of the Trinity in the unity of the third. And God says, what are we going to do to create something like us? A male and a female human, an ecstatic and covenanted sexual union. Where there's one person and another person and this mysterious third that emerges and defines their unity. And through faith in Christ, through covenant participation, we as God's people become united to him. And so we're us and he's him. And yet this unity takes place. So that whatever occurs with God occurs with us. And whatever occurs with us occurs with God. And that all gets wrapped up really decisively and clearly in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. As we step into covenant union with God, all of our stuff, even our sin, and our rubbish, and our fragility, and our brokenness, and our shame, and our embarrassment becomes true of God. God possesses all of that. And all of his goodness and his wholeness and everything that he has done to bury, do away with, and get rid of that brokenness, that, you can use the word sin, that imperfection, that garbage, that rubbish, that shame, that embarrassment, right? He's done away with so that all of his righteousness and all of his goodness and all of his wholeness and all of his health belongs to us. So as God is honored and elevated, so are we. As we have sinned and fallen short of God's glory, God has entered into that with us. That's why Holy Week is Holy Week. That's why holy just means special, set apart. That's why it's a special, set apart week, particularly Good Friday and Easter Sunday, because that is the crystal meth intensity of what happens, what has happened, what does happen, what continues to happen through our union with God through covenant participation with him, saying, yes, I'm making that promise along with you, God. And so we see the Jewish people are elevated and exalted, so much so that other people of other nationalities are like, dude, we want to be Jews. That's pretty cool. Sounds like a pretty good jam. Now, there's a couple of different ways that this last verse in chapter 8 gets translated. If you were to read the Jewish Publication Society or other contemporary Jewish commentaries, they would translate the Hebrew, other people pretended to be Jews or made out to be Jews. And they sort of interpret as like, ooh, man, if people think I'm a Jew and somebody attacks me, I can attack them back. Yay. Okay? If I could be so bold, there's a reason there's probably more of an ideological reason to translate it that way, because there's a sense of sort of Jewish ethnic identity is quite a big deal. And you can't just go, hey, I'm a Jew. And understandably so. Understandably so. Traditionally, though, we would regard this as, no, other people of other nationalities became Jews. Because to be a Jew is not strictly an ethnic identity in the Bible. Throughout all of the history of God's people, other ethnicities and other nationalities join God's covenant people. In fact, that's God's objective. Every nation and tribe, every people and tongue, being a part, participating in God's grand promise, his big covenant, that through union with him, according to his covenant, all of our sin and our shame and our brokenness and our junk is dead and buried and left behind, and we are left united with his wholeness, his health, his goodness. And that's for everybody. Every single last one of us. On the exact same terms. Because no one's that special. Everyone is that special. Do you see what I mean? And so we have people going, hey, yeah, being a part of God's people, that's a good gig, because it's gone from they're getting wiped out to actually it's going to be okay, I think, pretty quick. All right, let's carry on and see how this all unfolds. Chapter 9 gets a little bit dicey. On the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, the edict commanded by the king was to be carried out. So this is the day that Haman, when he was like, when are we going to kill all the Jews? I don't know, let's shake some dice and find out. All right. 12th and 13th of Adar, sounds good. I don't know how the dice worked with that. I really don't, whatever. But it wasn't really dice. It's pure is the Persian word for lots, So anyway, the Jews get to defend themselves on that same day, according to the new edict from King Xerxes, after Esther identified Haman as the genocidal lunatic that he is, or was. On this day, the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them. But now the tables were turned. Let's just stop right there for a moment. Now the tables were turned. God is a God of turntables. He's not a DJ, all right? He's not of turning tables, not turntables. I mean, we see Jesus turn tables, but all right, that's too far. God is a God that takes things that we think are right side up, but they're actually upside down, turns them upside down and actually right side up. All right? That's just what God does all the time. The tables have turned. And the Jews got the upper hand over those who hated them. The Jews assembled in their cities and all the provinces of King Xerxes to attack those determined to destroy them. No one could stand against them because the people of all the other nationalities were afraid of them. And all the nobles of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and the king's administrators helped the Jews because fear of Mordecai had seized them. Mordecai was prominent in the palace. His reputation spread throughout the provinces, and he became more and more powerful. The Jews struck down all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them. And they did what they pleased to those who hated them. In the citadel of Susa, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. They also killed, this will be fun, Parshandatha, Dalphon, Aspatha, Porotha, Adalia, Aradatha, Parmashta, Arasai, Aradai, and Vezatha. See, that's why I get paid the big bucks right there. All right. The 10 sons of Haman, son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. But they did not lay their hands on the plunder. The number of those killed in the citadel of Susa was reported. Well, we'll stop there for a second. Okay, it all seems a bit like, oh, geez. This is where Richard Dawkins kind of makes his point, like, oh, yeah, see, God's all like kill, death, murder. Kind of a God. Such isn't necessarily the case, because we must remember that this was a self-defense kind of a thing. And when it says the Jews had their way with them, it wasn't that we kind of read that our cultural sort of predisposition is like, well, that's not okay. It's sort of kind of the same way, too soon. Sort of the same way France had their way with England yesterday. And too soon. Sorry, guys. It hurt. It hurt me too. But it's just sort of unstoppable. Just sort of it's not that there were, no casualties among the Jews. Maybe there were, maybe there weren't. The point was they defended themselves thoroughly, absolutely thoroughly. But there's this line at the very end. They did not lay their hands on the plunder. Just tuck that right back there for just a little bit. The number of those killed in the citadel of Susa was reported to the king that same day. The king said to Queen Esther, the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men and the 10 sons of Haman in the citadel of Susa. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now, what is your petition? It will be given you. What is your request? It will be granted. Real quick. King Xerxes, throughout the course of the book of Esther, has gone from making demands of his queen to asking his queen what her demands might be. Again. Whoop. All right? If it pleases the king, Esther answered, give the Jews in Susa permission to carry out this day's edict tomorrow also, and let Haman's 10 sons be impaled on poles. While we're at it. Okay? And being impaled on the pole, by the way, they're already dead. So this is about, this is about showing them for what this is about humiliation. I hate, this might be uncomfortable for some of us. But God, I'm going to be careful. No, I'm going to say, God will shame his enemies. In the cross, he accepted and embraced possibly the most shameful thing humans have concocted. Carrying your cross if not totally, mostly naked, through a city with people spitting on you, hurling things at you, abusing you. We don't appreciate, our crosses have been sanitized and they look nice and clean in our stained glass and in our icons. I'm going to take just a moment. I'm aware of time. Let's take a little bit of a moment. Crucifixion was meant to humiliate the victim and keep them alive as long as possible while also killing them. Most people were on a cross at least a week, sometimes more. They would be fed and watered to keep them alive. Crosses were put together at varying elevations and in varying ways in order to display the body. It wasn't just like to kill a person. If that was all it was, they'd just do it in like some sort of corner over here. No, it was on a hilltop. And the whole thing is to put someone on display. Jesus didn't have a nice little modesty cloth. As he hung. And there's arguments, was Jesus nailed through his hands or through his wrist? They did it a lot of different ways. Just to have fun. To try to maximize pain and embarrassment. And you'd sit there and you'd hang there and birds would come and peck at you. And be eating you. And people would gather around and hurl insults. And you're sitting there starkers, and there's nothing you can do. Think of all of your most natural human reflexes when exposed. None of them actionable. Often the upright of the cross was left really rough. Sometimes they'd rough it up intentionally. Because what would happen is, obviously, you'd wear out. And what would happen is you wore out your clavicle and other anatomical realities in your throat would start to choke you. Not all the way, but just enough. And so the square nail through you think about your funny bone, that nerve goes through your wrist and into your fingertips. So nail between your radius and your ulna, so that square nail on circular rotation just grinds against your bones and against that nerve. You sink down, you lose your breath, and you reflexively, involuntarily, push up on the nail in your feet, rotate, rub your back along that splintered upright on a back that's already in ribbons. It wasn't uncommon that crosses would have just a bit of wood coming off of the back of the cross at an angle. Not so you could rest, but to humiliate and cause further injury when one would slide down. It was, and to this day, arguably is, the most humiliating and shameful way for a human being to be treated. God is just to bring his enemies to shame. God's immeasurable love, grace, and mercy is on display, that his enemies have the opportunity not to be. are pursued by that same love, are gathered by that same love, are restored and are healed by that same love. Caricatures, ignoble lies have been told about this. Love me or I'll smite you. Only an ununderstanding fool could understand it that way. While we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. He doesn't treat us as our sins deserve or reward us according to our iniquities. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And instead of justice, God pursues us in love and grace and mercy. I understand why we balk at the notion that God shames his enemies. But I think we only balk at that insofar as we don't really comprehend the way God's enemies have shamed him. And we might not appreciate the way we have shamed him in our radical disregard for him, in our thoughts, our attitudes, and our actions. Sorry, me too. Like I'm not trying to exceptionalize myself and be like, you guys. No, like it's us, right? It's us. All right. So God is shaming his enemies. Here, these 10 sons of Haman are going to be put on this pole on display. This is what happens to those who oppose God and oppose his people. Verse 14. So the king commanded that this be done. An edict was issued in Susa, and they impaled the 10 sons of Haman. The Jews in Susa came together on the 14th day of the month of Adar, and they put to death in Susa 300 men, but they did not lay their hands on the plunder. Meanwhile, the remainder of the Jews who were in the king's provinces also assembled to protect themselves and get relief from their enemies. They killed 75,000 of them, but did not lay their hands on the plunder. This happened on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th they rested and made it a day of feasting and joy. The Jews in Susa, however, had assembled on the 13th and 14th, and then on the 15th they rested and made it a day of feasting and joy. That is why rural Jews, those living in villages, observe the 14th of the month of Adar as a day of joy and feasting, a day for giving presents to one another. Here's what we see when God's people have a victory. They don't lay their hands on the plunder. They don't lay their hands on the plunder. There's two things going on here. One is demonstrating that they're different. They're different. That's what people do. They attack other people to take their stuff. Right? That's what's happening now. That's what often happens. Someone gets attacked so their stuff can get taken. That's not the Jewish people here. They're not like, we want to take your stuff. We're cool. God's provided for us. This is self-defense because you guys remember how you had that genocidal plan to absolutely kill, murder all of us and take our stuff? No, we're just defending ourselves and we're not taking your stuff. We don't need your stuff. The second thing is this is a correction from way back when. Remember when I said Mordecai's genealogy infers King Saul? And back in 1 Samuel chapter 15, Saul, who was then, hundreds of years before the Persian Empire, was the king of the Jewish people, the Israelites, they were called at that time. And he had a battle, and God told him, don't take the plunder, and he took the plunder. And so part of what's happening here is the Jewish people were like, no, we learned a lesson from back there. We got a bit greedy, kept the plunder because it looked good. And actually, we need to not do this. And so there's a correction of the past that takes place here as well. Because one of the things that's happening for the Jewish people post-exile is they're being restored in their identity. And this restoration goes all the way back to Saul, who was kind of a bum king compared to David, who was like, king, right? And so there's this restoration of the Jewish people, even all the way back to Saul, and that they didn't take the plunder. Here's the other thing they did, is they celebrated. They celebrated their deliverance. We're going to talk more about this next week when we discuss the actual holiday of Purim. But they celebrate and they give gifts. They don't take plunder, they give gifts. Our victory isn't so we can take stuff. Out of our victory, by God's hand, we give stuff. So as God's people this morning, there's a couple things I want us to think about. Thing number one, and I wasn't really intending to get to the whole shame thing. That just happened. So, no, I don't apologize. Thing number one is, have you stepped into and said, yeah, God, that promise you made, I want that to be mine too. I'm in on that. I'm in on that. I have no idea what it's going to mean, but I'm in on it, and I'm willing to figure out what it means as I live it. That might be one thing for you to grapple with this morning. The other thing to grapple with is maybe you want victory, like, as Christians, sometimes we want vindication. Because we want the honor, we want the glory, we want the stuff. It's not about that. Our vindication isn't so we can take the plunder. And if our motivation is to bubble up to the top, we're probably missing something. Right? So we might need a little bit of a dose of humility and say, I don't just want vindication because I want to be recognized. Right? But I want vindication, safety, and security so that I can bless, so that I can give. So that other people would experience something of the goodness, the grace, the mercy, and the love of God and join many nations entered into God's covenant with him. That's what it means to be a Jew. That's what it means to be a Christian. It's to enter into God's covenant with him. And that's what we do when we take the cup of the new covenant in Christ's blood. It's forgiveness of sin. It's God's Spirit within us. It's uniting ourselves with God. All he is, all he does. And then sharing, giving, loving. Cool? All right. Let's just take, let's just go ahead. Let's go ahead and stand as we prepare for our time of confession. If whoever's leading song worship for the moment, if you guys come on up and let's stand to prepare for our time of confession.